5th of January, 2024. After a smooth takeoff, Alaska Airlines Flight 1282 was gently crossing Portland, Oregon, heading to Ontario. But within minutes, something happened to this Boeing 737 that sucked passengers' phones and headrests straight toward the sky. Even a teenage boy sitting in row number 25 had his shirt ripped off and blown out of the plane. His mother somehow held him tightly so the boy wouldn't be sucked out of the plane. All these happened because a hole dangerously ripped open in the side of the aircraft. But how did this happen? This wasn't a freak accident. It was a mistake built into the plane before it ever flew. This is the breathtaking story of Alaska Airlines Flight 1282, a tiny failure that could have killed 177 people. Around 5 o'clock local time, January 5th, the Alaska Airlines Boeing 737 MAX 9 sat quietly at the gate in Portland Airport. It was a brand new aircraft, barely 2 months old, fresh from Boeing's assembly line. So no one on board had any reason to think that within minutes their routine flight would turn into one of the most shocking aviation incidents in recent years. The crew of 6 prepared for departure as 171 passengers took their seats. The aircraft had space for 178 people, but a few seats were empty, including seats 26 Alpha and 26 Bravo. Those were right next to the mid-cabin door plug. Before the flight, the pilots noted something in the maintenance log. Over the past 3 days, the aircraft's pressurization system, which keeps cabin air breathable at high altitudes, had been acting strangely. But engineers couldn't find any obvious fault. Now here you need to know some background about it to understand the entire context. The Boeing 737 is designed with 3 pressurization controllers. 2 of them are automatic and 1 is manual. The automatic ones handle cabin pressure by themselves, keeping the air inside comfortable as the aircraft climbs higher. The manual one is a backup, meant for emergencies. It requires pilots to adjust a valve at the back of the aircraft by hand, controlling how air leaves the cabin. It's difficult to use and is rarely needed. Normally, the automatic controllers take turns. One works on one flight, the other takes over on the next. If one fails, warning lights appear in the cockpit: a master caution, an AUTOFAIL light, and a green ALTN light, which means the system has switched to its backup. When this happens, pilots simply follow a checklist and they move the switch to alternate, which clears the caution lights except for the green one, reminding them that only one controller is now active. That kind of fault is not rare and usually not serious. It can happen due to small internal issues. But since there's a backup and even a manual mode, the aircraft can still fly safely. But on this particular Boeing 737, this warning appeared on 3 consecutive flights. Alaska Airlines decided to limit that aircraft to routes over land instead of over water. This was a simple safety precaution. If cabin pressure failed at a high altitude, the aircraft would have to descend to 10,000 feet, where the air is breathable. And keeping the aircraft over land meant it would always be near an airport to land safely if that happened. This means, in the hindsight, the airlines had an idea that some accident might happen any day because of this unsolved safety issue. But pressurization controllers and doors are entirely different systems. Nothing pointed to anything dangerous, and so the plane wasn't grounded. That decision, made with good reason at the time, would later gain tragic importance. The captain that night, Jason Ambrosi, was highly experienced. With over 12,700 flight hours, half of them on the Boeing 737. His first officer, Emily Whiprud, had more than 8,300 hours in total and over 1,500 on the 737. The first officer completed even the pre-flight inspection around the aircraft, walking under the wings and along the fuselage. Everything looked normal. The captain set up the cockpit and they reviewed their departure briefing. And soon they were cleared to push back. At 4:50 in the evening, local time, Flight 1282 started taxiing. The engine stabilized, and at 5:06 the captain pushed the throttles forward. The aircraft accelerated down the runway 28 left of the Portland International Airport. And at 5:07 in the evening, it finally took off and climbed smoothly. Passengers settled in. Some watched movies, others chatted. The cabin crew started the safety demonstration and began preparing for the short journey. Once airborne, it began a left turn toward the southeast, climbing to 7,000 feet. Air traffic control soon cleared them to 15,000 feet. As the climb continued, the pilots ran their usual pressurization checks. These checks ensure the cabin is being pressurized properly as the plane climbs higher. They are done at several stages. The first step starts at 3,000 feet and is repeated at every 10,000 feet. The cabin should climb slowly, around 800 to 1,000 feet per minute, while the aircraft itself climbs much faster. Initially in this flight, everything seemed normal in the cockpit, but in the back, something was beginning to go terribly wrong. The aircraft continued its climb. The first officer, Emily Wypred, contacted Seattle Center and received clearance to climb to 23,000 feet. Her voice sounded calm, routine. No one knew what was coming. The aircraft reached 10,000 feet, and the captain increased speed to 271 knots. The difference between inside and outside air pressure reached 5.7 psi. But normal cruise level pressure difference is around 8.3 psi, so the aircraft was about 2/3 of the way there. And as the aircraft climbed through 16,000 feet, something unexpected happened. First, a sudden loud bang came abruptly, which shocked everyone. The sound was unlike anything most passengers had ever heard, a violent explosion of air and metal. Something just ripped through the cabin. And before anyone could make sense of it, a huge gust of wind burst through the cabin, followed by a chilling rush of cold air. Basically, what happened was, a deafening explosion tore through the cabin. The door plug blew out completely. The last bit of metal holding it in place gave way, and the massive rush of air forced it outward. The door plug ripped free, tearing through insulation and soundproofing. It missed the aircraft's tail by pure luck and fell toward the ground below. The hole it left behind was the size of an emergency exit. Literally, a teenage boy sitting nearby had his shirt torn off and sucked toward the hole. His mother held him with all her strength as papers, seat cushions, and small objects flew out of the cabin. Headphones, mobile phones, and pieces of paper vanished into the night. The oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, swinging wildly as passengers gasped for air. The cabin felt like a nightmare. In the cockpit, the decompression hit instantly. The cockpit door, which was locked, blew open from the pressure change. It smashed into the lavatory door and jammed. The captain's head slammed into his head-up display, nearly tearing his headset off. The first officer's headset was yanked away completely. Warning alarms filled the cockpit. The cabin altitude had shot past 10,000 feet, meaning the air inside was no longer breathable. Loose objects flew around the cockpit. The pilot's ears popped as the pressure change hit them. The sudden blast of cold air and debris made it almost impossible to think clearly. The cabin pressure warning lights flashed red, and a loud alarm filled the flight deck. But luckily, both pilots had been trained for this, so they knew what to do. The captain and first officer both reached for their oxygen masks and began emergency procedures. In aviation, a sudden loss of cabin pressure is called explosive decompression. It can happen so fast that a person loses consciousness in seconds. In such cases, the first rule is simple: get down to breathable air as fast as possible. So their first task was to put on their oxygen masks. At high altitudes, a person can lose consciousness in seconds without oxygen. The pilots grabbed their masks, fitted them on, and switched them to full flow. Only then did they regain control of their senses. During those seconds, the autopilot kept the plane climbing to 16,300 feet. Once communication was restored, the captain stopped the climb. They began the rapid depressurization checklist, memorized steps practiced over and over in simulator training. Oxygen on, communication established, pressurization switched to manual, outflow valve closed. These actions confirmed that the problem wasn't from inside the system. The cabin pressure was gone because something massive had failed in the aircraft structure itself. The readings showed zero differential pressure, which means the air pressure became same inside and outside. And that meant the air inside the plane had escaped completely. The cabin altitude, which is the air pressure maintained in the cabin at a certain height above sea level, matched the outside altitude. The aircraft was simply open to the sky. The pilots had a decision to make. They could start an emergency descent, but that can be risky if other aircraft are below, or if they haven't yet told air traffic control. They paused for just a moment to assess. The priority was to make sure the aircraft stayed under control and everyone on board could breathe through their oxygen masks. During this time, the cabin was in chaos. Screaming wind, frozen air, debris flying everywhere. Passengers held onto seats, eyes wide with fear. The crew struggled to check on everyone while staying buckled themselves. Miraculously, no one was near the hole, because those two empty seats, 26A and B, were placed near that. If anyone had been sitting there or even standing in the aisle, this story would have had a tragic ending. Despite the shock, the aircraft remained flyable. The engines were running, the wings were steady. The pilots now knew they had to bring the aircraft down fast to a safe altitude to give the passengers breathable air again. So the pilots began their emergency descent procedure. This procedure is something pilots memorize through repeated simulator training, because there's no time to read the checklist. The tasks are split between the captain and the first officer. The first officer reached up to the overhead panel, checking that the passenger oxygen masks had dropped. She switched on the seatbelt sign to make sure everyone stayed seated. Then she set the engine start switches to continuous mode, which ensures the engines keep running even during turbulence, and turned on all exterior lights so that other aircraft could see them clearly. Next, she tuned the transponder to code 7700, which signals an emergency to all air traffic controllers. They also made the Mayday call. In her message, she reported the depressurization and said the aircraft was descending to 10,000 feet, the minimum safe altitude. At the same time, the captain took control of the descent. He made a quick announcement to the cabin crew through the public address system, telling them to sit down and use their oxygen masks. Then he set the altitude selector to 10,000 feet on the control panel. He chose a controlled descent mode and prepared to turn the aircraft away from any traffic below. He could have increased the speed to make the descent faster, but doing so might have risked further damage to the aircraft's structure. Not knowing how bad the damage was, he kept the current speed. He pulled back the thrust levers to idle and extended the speed brakes, which are panels that increase drag and slow the aircraft. The nose dropped and the plane began descending rapidly through the dark sky. The crew's communication with air traffic control was difficult. Talking through oxygen masks is hard because of the valve system that pushes oxygen into the mask with each breath. The rushing air sounds like heavy breathing and often distorts the voice. On top of that, the cockpit was filled with the roar of escaping air. Still, the message was clear enough. The aircraft was descending fast and in distress. In the cabin, flight attendants struggled to stay calm. One of them managed to close the cockpit door that had jammed against a lavatory door during the explosion. This helped reduce the noise and allowed the pilots to hear each other. As the aircraft passed 9,000 feet, the warning horn for cabin altitude finally stopped. The air inside was once again breathable. The pilots began to catch their breath, but their work was far from over. They now needed to land as soon as possible. So they prepared for an immediate return to Portland. The aircraft turned left, aligning with the approach path for runway 28 left, the same runway they had departed from only minutes earlier. Air traffic control cleared them for an instrument landing, a system that guides planes safely to the runway using radio signals. The descent had to be carefully managed. A normal descent rate is around 500 feet per minute, but this one was much steeper. The captain had to balance between descending quickly to reach safety and avoiding too much discomfort for passengers. He chose safety. The priority was to get the damaged aircraft on the ground before anything else failed. As the plane leveled out for final approach, passengers could see the runway lights glowing through the darkness. Only the noise was still loud and the cold wind still poured through the damaged section. The only hope was that the ground was getting closer. At 5:26 in the evening, the aircraft touched down safely on runway 28 left. First, it rolled to a stop and taxied to the gate. It was surrounded by emergency vehicles flashing red and blue lights. Passengers sat in stunned silence. Some cried softly, others hugged their seatmates, and ultimately they couldn't believe they had survived. It was kind of a miracle that out of 177 people on board, only 7 passengers and 1 flight attendant had minor injuries. Everyone else was completely safe. The quick response from the pilots had prevented what could have been a major disaster. But one mistake followed. The crew forgot to turn off the cockpit voice recorder. This device records all sounds and talks inside the cockpit for 2 hours. Since the plane stayed powered after landing, the recording got replaced with new audio. So investigators lost important evidence from the incident. When the passengers disembarked, investigators rushed to the aircraft. And what they saw stunned them. There was a big rectangular hole where the door plug had been. The cabin's insulation was torn and hanging in pieces, and the edges of the plane's body showed smooth, cut metal, which proved that the plug had broken off suddenly and completely. At first, no one could understand how such a failure was even possible. The door plug was designed to stay locked even under extreme air pressure. It wasn't something that could simply fall off. The only way it could come loose is if the bolts securing it were missing. But for that clarity, they needed to find out the missing door plug. Days later, search teams found it in a backyard in Portland, nearly 5 miles from the airport. It had landed intact, complete with its window. The discovery gave investigators their first big clue. The mounting points that were supposed to hold the plug in place were completely empty. There were literally no bolts, no cotter pins, nothing. That meant the plug hadn't failed. It had been installed incorrectly right from the start. Someone had simply forgotten to put the bolts back in after maintenance, and the result turned out so deadly. The 4 bolts that were supposed to hold the left mid-exit door plug in place were missing. The plug was held in position only by its weight and by how it fit into the frame. It was not designed to bear pressure pushing outward. It simply sat in place, locked by metal fittings. As the aircraft climbed and cabin pressure built up, the plug began to shift slightly upward, little by little. The cause of this movement is still unknown. It might have been due to vibration, turbulence, or the small assist springs that help lift doors during evacuation. Whatever the reason, each small movement caused the locking parts, the stop fittings and pads, to fall further out of alignment. To find the root of everything, investigators traced the story back through the aircraft's entire history. The fuselage had been built by Spirit Aerosystems in Wichita, Kansas. During production, engineers discovered damaged rivets near the same mid-cabin plug and recorded the issue in Boeing's database. Spirit's team was supposed to fix it. They even later reported that the problem was solved. But when Boeing engineers checked, they found the rivets had just been painted over. Worse, the seal around the door plug had been damaged during the failed repair. The team debated whether the plug needed to be fully removed to replace the seal. If it was removed, Boeing's rules required a full inspection afterward. But if it was only opened, no inspection was needed. For these reasons, someone decided to mark it as opened. That choice saved time. No inspection happened. When the plug was reinstalled, nobody checked if the bolts were put back. But in photos taken later at Boeing's Renton facility, those bolts were clearly missing. The holes were empty. Still, the aircraft continued through assembly, was painted, fitted with its interior, and delivered to Alaska Airlines in perfect-looking condition. When the interior panels were installed, the missing bolts became invisible. No one could see them again. The aircraft passed all pressure tests because the cabin door plugs are held firmly in place when there's no significant air pressure difference. Only in flight, when the air inside is under much higher pressure than outside, could the missing bolts become deadly. And that moment came on the 5th of January, 2024. As the aircraft climbed, the cabin pressure rose. Without the bolts, nothing held the plug firmly against its stops. The pressure pushed it upward. The rollers slipped out of their guides, and in an instant, the plug blew away. The aftermath was immediate. The Federal Aviation Administration ordered all Boeing 737 MAX 9 aircraft with similar plugs to be grounded. Airlines around the world canceled flights as they checked each aircraft. Some plugs were found to have loose fittings, proving the issue wasn't isolated. Boeing and Spirit Aerosystems faced intense scrutiny. Whistleblower reports revealed that workers were under immense pressure to meet production targets. Some quality inspections had been skipped or rushed. The missing bolts on Flight 1282 became the symbol of a much deeper problem: the growing tension between speed and safety in modern aircraft manufacturing. It took only seconds for that plug to blow out, but the chain of mistakes that led to it had stretched over months, starting in a factory in Malaysia, passing through Wichita, and ending in Renton. Each person in that chain did their job, but one missing check, one unfiled record, one decision to skip documentation had allowed a tiny gap to grow into a life-threatening failure. The only good part was that in the end no one died. But for Boeing, the event became a wake-up call. The company's most important aircraft was once again grounded. Public trust, already fragile after previous MAX incidents, took another hit. Reports later suggested that some passengers seated near the left-hand mid-exit door plug had heard a whistling sound on earlier flights. The cabin crew was allegedly told about it, and they might have passed it on to the pilots. But there's no record of it in the aircraft's maintenance log. That missing note would later matter more than anyone could have imagined. And yet the mystery remained. Investigators still don't know exactly who removed those bolts, or why no one noticed they were missing. Somewhere in a crowded factory, a small oversight went unnoticed, and months later, 200 lives came seconds away from disaster. Flight 1282 proved how fast things can fail and how calm action can save lives. The cause is still under review, but every safety layer was held just long enough to bring everyone home. So what else is flying above us right now with another tiny mistake waiting to surface? How many near disasters go unnoticed every single day because someone chose speed over safety? If this story shook you, don't just move on, share it, talk about it, and subscribe to this channel for more. Because the next time luck might not be enough to bring everyone home.